All right, welcome. If you're a senior surgical trainee prepping for your Viva, you already know it's not just about what you know, it's about how you say it. So today, we're going to crack one of the landmark trials you absolutely have to know inside and out, CAPRIE.
So let's start with the question itself, because this is probably what you're going to get asked. The trick isn't just dumping a load of facts, it's about packaging them into a really slick, confident 2 or 3 minute summary. And by the end of this explainer, you are going to have the perfect structure to do exactly that. And here's how we're going to build your answer. We'll go through these 5 key areas, and we'll do it in this specific order. Trust me, this is exactly how an examiner wants to hear you break down a trial. It shows you can think critically about the evidence.
First things first, you've got to set the scene. Before you even say the word CAPRIE, you need to show the examiner you get the clinical problem that the trial was designed to solve. What was the gap in our knowledge? So before CAPRIE came along, the antiplatelet world was pretty straightforward. You had aspirin, which we knew worked, but it came with that risk of GI bleeds. And then you had the more powerful stuff, ticlopidine, but it had this really nasty side effect, bone marrow depression. So the clinical need was obvious, right? We needed a drug that was at least as good as aspirin, hopefully better, but definitely safer than ticlopidine.
And enter Clopidogrel. It's in the same chemical family as ticlopidine, ethienopyridine, and it hits that same crucial ADP pathway on platelets. So the big question on everyone's mind was, could this new drug give us that extra potency, but without the really dangerous side effects? And that really boils it down to the core clinical question. This is the sentence you want to have in your back pocket for the Viva. You'd say something like, the CAPRIE trial was set up to find out if clopidogrel was more effective than standard aspirin for preventing major ischemic events in high-risk patients, and, crucially, whether it had a better safety profile.
Okay, part 2, the methodology. Now, talking about the trial design isn't just about reeling off a list. It's your chance to show the examiner you understand what actually makes the evidence robust and believable. The easiest way to describe this is to just use the PICO framework. The population, and this was huge at the time, was over 19,000 high-risk patients. They'd either had a recent MI, a recent stroke, or they had symptomatic peripheral arterial disease. The intervention was clopidogrel 75 milligrams once a day. The comparator was aspirin, 325 milligrams a day. And the primary outcome they were looking for was a composite endpoint, ischemic stroke, MI, or vascular death. And of course, you have to mention the design itself. It was a top-quality, international, multi-center, double-blind RCT published in The Lancet back in 1996.
Right, let's get to the juicy bit. What did the trial actually find? For any paper you discuss in the Viva, you have to know the headline result. And for CAPRIE, it really all boils down to one number.
This is it, 8.7%. Honestly, if you forget everything else from this trial, you have to remember this number. So what is this 8.7%? It's the relative risk reduction. It tells us how much clopidogrel reduced the risk of that primary composite endpoint, stroke, MI, or vascular death, compared to aspirin. So if we dig into the details just a little bit, you can see the actual event rates weren't that different. 5.32% for clopidogrel versus 5.83% for aspirin. But that difference gave us that 8.7% relative risk reduction. And importantly, it was statistically significant, with a p-value of 0.043. And you can see the confidence interval doesn't cross 0, which confirms there was a real, albeit modest, overall benefit.
But, and this is the really critical bit of nuance that shows you've properly understood the paper, this is what everyone talks about. The benefit wasn't the same for everybody. In the patients who'd had an MI, there was basically no benefit at all. But just look at the PAD group, a whopping 23.8% relative risk reduction. This finding, this heterogeneity of effect, is probably the most important discussion point to come out of CAPRIE.
And what about safety? Remember, that was the other half of the original clinical question. Well, clopidogrel absolutely delivered. No signs of that nasty neutropenia we saw with ticlopidine, and actually, it caused less major bleeding than the 325 milligram dose of aspirin they used, so it really did achieve its goal of being a safer but still potent antiplatelet drug. Okay, so you've presented the results. That's good, but to really push for that distinction, you have to go one step further. You need to critique the trial. You need to think like a consultant. What were its weaknesses? And what was its real-world impact? Here are the smart points to make. The single most important limitation is that the trial was not powered to look at those subgroups individually. That means that incredible finding in the PAD group, well, we should treat it with a little bit of caution.
It's what we'd call hypothesis generating. The other key point to mention is the aspirin dose. They use 325 milligrams, which is much higher than the 75 we typically use now. And that might have made clopidogrel look a little bit better on the safety side, especially regarding bleeding risk.
So what was the impact on the real world? Well, it was massive. CAPRIE established clopidogrel as a better alternative to aspirin, particularly for our vascular patients with PAD. And almost overnight, it made ticlopidine obsolete. It was just kicked to the curb because clopidogrel was so much safer. It really was a game changer.
Right, let's put it all together then. How do you take all of that information and turn it into a slick, polished, and confident answer for your Viva?
This is your recipe for success. It's a 5-step plan. You start with the clinical question and the background. Then you describe the trial design using PICO. Third, you state that headline 8.7% result. Then, and this is key, you immediately add the nuance about the huge PAD benefit. And finally, you wrap up with the great safety profile and its overall impact. You follow that structure, you will nail it.
So when the examiner asks you about CAPRIE, you just take a breath, look them in the eye, and you begin something like this. CAPRIE was a landmark, double-blind, randomized controlled trial published in The Lancet in 1996. It was designed to address the need for an antiplatelet agent that was more effective than aspirin, but safer than ticlopidine for secondary prevention. And from there, you just walk them through those 5 steps we just laid out.
And at the end of the day, if you want that one-sentence, safe, consultant-level summary, here it is. CAPRIE demonstrated that clopidogrel offers a modest but statistically significant 8.7% relative risk reduction over aspirin for secondary prevention in a broad population of patients with atherosclerotic disease, with a particularly profound benefit seen in those with PAD and a favorable safety profile. That single sentence tells the examiner you get the trial, its main result, and its most important nuance. Master that, and you'll be in a very good place.